Awesome. All righty. So once we got that sorted, seamless big book study. Let's pick up where we left off last week. And what we're picking up is the very bottom of page 63. And just some very, very quick review. So we're going at the very, very bottom of 63, where it says, next we launched. So what we did last week was we spoke about the third step and our third step decision. And so one of the things is we haven't really made a decision if we haven't followed it up with action, right? So we made this decision, but a decision without action gets me nowhere, right? Like we've got some wonderful people from Hawaii. If I decide that I'm going to go to Hawaii, I don't magically get there. I've got to take action to get there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to follow up our decision with action. And again, our decision is essentially to work these steps like our life depends on it, because it does. And that is how our will in our life gets turned over to that power which is God. And so that's what we're doing. It says, next we launched. And again, that tells us that we are going to do this with some velocity. Not next we sauntered, not next we frolicked. We launched with some velocity, with some vigor. And one of the things I want to point out, when we spoke in this book previously about the fourth dimension of existence, that fourth dimension is just a synonym for the spiritual awakening. It tells us how we get there. The first time we heard it about that fourth dimension, we heard Bill being catapulted. So again, with some velocity. And the second time we heard it, it was rocketed. So we got to launch, because that is what we got to do. And step one, I realized I'm going to die if I stay where I'm at. Step two, there is a solution. There is a place to be. So I got to hustle my bustle to get there. And that's what we're doing. So we're launching out on a course of vigorous action. What that means is I'm going to do, oh goodness, no worry, just glad you came. And for those that joined late, we're at the bottom of page 63. And you didn't join late, you joined right on time because you're here now. Thanks for coming. Vigorous action. What that means is I've got to take action. And it says the first step of which is a personal house cleaning. You know, one of the things that I love so much is we spoke about the different ways in which we can orientate ourselves to God. And we spoke of that on the bottom of page 62, where it says, one of the ones, and the one that I think is just great, is that he is the principal, we are his agents. Now, of course, that means an agent is somebody who goes and acts on behalf of the principal in a legal way. But how I like to look at it is like, 00 page, secret agent for God, pew pew. All right, I've been fired from the management position of my life, and I'm gonna go work for God. I signed that employment contract. What do? What's my super secret special mission? Personal house cleaning. Oh man, I was running the whole show, or at least I thought I was. And now I'm relegated to house cleaning. And it says, which many of us had never attempted. Now, I had somebody who asked me about whether or not I could share I have this metaphor about step 4, which is about cleaning a house, and I'll share this in just a bit when I finish this paragraph. Turns out I take requests, so if you got any requests, you let me know. So it says, though our decision, now our decision is step 3. That third step decision was a vital, and vital is life-giving, crucial, like absolutely important step. It could have little permanent effect. And as an alcoholic, that is what I need. I need permanent effect. It says, unless at once. So that tells me the timeline that I ought to have between my third step and picking up the pen to paper on my fourth step. It says next, which tells us right now, but then very clearly at once. So if I'm diving in, if I've made the decision, I'm going to say it does not behoove me to sit on this step. It does not behoove me to not take action. I don't know why I'm using words like that. I've got to dive in. So it says, unless at once, followed by a strenuous effort. Oh man, it's going to take effort, lame. A strenuous effort to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us. And what we're talking about there is the stuff inside of me that is blocking me from that power, which is God, or higher power, or creator, or spirit of the universe. I've got to clear away that channel. You know, we read in step 3 about how selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. So we've got to clear that away. It says our liquor was a symptom. So we had to get down to causes and conditions. And that's what we're trying to do. See, the 4th step, what we're doing here is just trying to clear away the stuff inside of me, to take inventory, to see what's blocking me off from God. And so in my little house metaphor, I have this little house metaphor. And I believe that in the depth of my soul, what I have is a spiritual house. Now, if you're here for the house metaphor, what you have, and again, you don't have to be like, absolutely not, Paige. I do not have a spiritual house in the depth of my soul. That's stupid. I don't want one. You don't have to. But if you're picking up what I'm throwing down, at the depth of your soul, there's a spiritual house. And what I want you to know is your house is good. Your house is beautiful. Your house is wonderful. Your house was created by the absolutely most amazing, capital D, capital A, divine architect, the spiritual Frank Lloyd Wright of architects, right? And I wish I knew more other like famous architects. That's the only one I know. But it's a beautiful, beautiful, wonderful house. Now, talking about me, not talking about you, the problem that I have is I'm a bit of a hoarder. Like, you know, like we got to call in TLC, bring in the cameras. Like I am a hoarder. Like it is bad. And again, you guys, I'm sure, do not have a spiritual hoarding problem like I do, but I have this problem. And so I've got these things. Now, these things are resentments. And my resentments are like newspapers. They're decades old, and they're piled all the way from floor till ceiling. Piled up, piled up, piled up, piled up. And what happens is when my newspapers are piled up from floor till ceiling, that blocks out the windows and that light can't come in. And I'm sitting in that darkness. And again, what I have, you guys don't have to have them, but I have is fears. And man, I got a lot of them. And my fears, they're like empty bottles and cans that are strewn all over the floor. And see, I can't move, I can't step without crashing into them and having them clink and clatter and sound bigger and louder than they really are. And because I'm in the dark, I don't know where to stand, and I don't know where to step, and I don't know where to go. And again, I'm just talking about me, but I have what we'll look at, which is called sex conduct. And that's a little like the dead cats behind the freezer. You know what I mean? I know they're there. I can smell them. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Now, I also want you to know that no cats were harmed in the making of this metaphor. All animals are safe. It is only a metaphor. And so what I'm going to be doing in that 4th step is just cleaning that spiritual house. And so I'm going to start, and I'm going to take those newspapers. That's where we're going to start. We're going to start with our resentments. I'm going to start, and I'm going to take them down, and I'm going to put them into bags and boxes. And when I do, I'm going to have a look at them. And I will find that the information was wrong the whole time. That's just my experience. See, I thought it said everyone was a jerk. Turns out I was the one being the jerk, and it was news to me, right? And I start cleaning that up. And as I do that, that light begins to come in through that window. And it usually is. Once we get to that 4th column in our resentments, we can see that light come on in the eyes of others, right? And I love in this book the metaphor of God as light, because light is not what I see. Light is the way in which I see. And so I don't see light. Hi, buddy. Light allows me to see. And He's always got great timing. He just wants hugs and kisses right now, and you'll get some. But light is not what I see. Light is the way in which I see. And see, the room doesn't change when I turn on the light switch, and yet everything about that room changes. And so I can look at my life, and we can look at our experience with the fourth step, right? When I've taken that step, as my childhood got better, did the jerks on the road start to drive better? Did my family get better? Did the people, I know, he is a cutie. Did my family get better? And for those that are listening only, my dog showed up and he just decided he wanted attention, which I get it. he just wanted just one attention, please. Just one attention. I will give you. Yeah. And so they got better, and yet they did not change. Oh, goodness. Bum down, mister. Bum down. Bum down. Thank you. He just wanted to sit right on me. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. It's good manners. But my childhood, my family, my job, the people on the freeway, and now he leaves. Just loves me and leaves me like the men in my life. I'm just joking. I'm just joking. He was leaning on my examples for the 4 steps. So I think he was like, oh, I don't like those coil notebooks. Some go. But all of that changes, and yet it didn't change. My childhood didn't change. My family didn't change. None of that changed, but how I see it changes. And so what happens is and I'm just going to kind of take the metaphor to its conclusion, even though we're talking about the 4th step right now. What I do is in that 5th step, when I sit down with God and another human being, is I take all of that garbage out of the house. And then when that garbage, I take it to the curb. And step 6 becomes about being willing, and step 7 is simply about asking for the cosmic garbage man to take it away. And that's what I'm doing 4 through 7. And see, it turns out, right? See, I think I do that 5th step. I think, oh boy, do I get a promotion? Not really. Did all that house cleaning, get a promotion? No, you're kind of just relegated to the willingness department. See, I think I need to be a defect removal. Turns out just willingness and humbly asking. That is my responsibility. And so that's all we're doing in the 4th step. We're just clearing out that house. But again, an important reminder, that house is good. That house is beautiful. That house is wonderful. That house is valuable. So for those that just joined, we're on page 64 because we go very quickly in this big book study. Made it a paragraph. It says, therefore, we started upon a personal inventory. This was step 4. A business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. And so that's an important line that I skipped over for a lot of years. It implies to me that taking a regular inventory is important, because when I got here, my business was broke. You know what I mean? My life was unmanageable. I managed my life into an unmanageable position. The dumpster was on fire. It was about as bad as it could be. That is where my life was. And if I do not continue to take a regular inventory, that stuff in the house will build up and build up and build up. And that light will get blocked, right? And so I need to continue to do this work. I'm never done. But it's way more fun than it sounds. I genuinely have a lot of fun with inventory. So if you're hearing that and you're like, oh, I got to continue. Yeah, but it's honestly, it's an incredible, wonderful way of life. So it says taking a commercial inventory is a fact-finding, fact-facing process. So if you've ever worked in a company or a business where you had to take an inventory, what you're looking at is you're like, what do we have in stock? And we'll see what we have excess of, we'll see what's damaged, we'll see what's not selling, right? But you'll notice when you've gone to work and done an inventory, you're not calling the business. I mean, maybe if you're a little resentful, you're like, my jerk of a boss made me do an inventory. But we're not there talking about how awful the company is. We're not talking about how awful the business is. We're just there to see what's working and what's not. Fact-finding, fact-facing process. That's what we're here to do. And it says, it is an effort to discover the truth about the stock in trade. That's what we're here to do, to see the truth. One object, so one purpose of the 4-step inventory, just like a commercial inventory, is to disclose damaged or unsaleable goods, to get rid of them promptly and without regret. So if I'm doing a commercial inventory and I see there's a lot of expired product or damaged product or product that's just not selling, and we've marked it down time and time and time again, and it's not selling, it's not working. We don't sit around and sulk and like, man, this company is awful. We take it and we get rid of it. That's what we're doing, promptly, without regret. And it says, if the owner of the business is to be successful, he cannot fool himself about value. It says, we did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup, which caused our failure. Being convinced that self manifested in various ways was what had defeated us. Now that's what we're talking about again in step 3, when it spoke selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. So that is what we're looking at, right? What are the common manifestations of self, where self has arisen and blocked me off from that power which is God? Well, it can be helpful to make a note that the common manifestations of self that we're going to look at in this 4-step inventory, this is going to be our resentments, it's going to be our fears, and it's going to be our sex conduct. And if that kind of freaks you out a little bit, you could just say relationship conduct. It's all right. We're just going to have a look at those 3 things. And so it's important to understand that those are the 3 sections of my inventory process. Now, sometimes other people have different inventories or a different way of doing it, and that's okay. I'm going to show you how I was shown, and I'm going to show you how it ties into the book. And what I found is this to be just a good, practical way of doing it. Some people use printed out worksheets. That's great. Some people do it different ways. That's great. But I'm going to show you what has worked for me. And so before we get into an inventory, what do we need? A notebook. I need a notebook. And I'm a big believer pen to paper. Now, there are some people that, have disabilities and have to type it out, but I'm a big believer, for me, pen to paper. So I get a notebook and I get a pen. And this is a little bit of a page tip and trick, because you're going to do a lot of writing on your 4th step. So get a pen that you like. You know what I mean? I don't go and spend like $200 on a pen or nothing crazy like that. We alcoholics, all or nothing thinking. But just get a pen that you like writing with. It's just a little thing. Like, don't get one of those ones that's running out of ink and you're frustrated. Yeah, absolutely. Get a good pen that you like. And this is a good size notebook. I think it's A4 size. That's such a nerdy comment. It's about an A4, could be an A5 of paper size. I'm trying to give it like audio descriptions for those that are only listening, because this is a good size notebook. We can't see the notebook, but I wouldn't go smaller. Where did it go? I'm like, did he take the notebook? Thank you. Did he take the notebook? He did not. I found it. So this is also a good size. And also I have done some Al-Anon work. So it does fit. Did a set of Al-Anon steps and been actually working on a set of Al-Anon traditions. So it's fitting. These are good sizes. I wouldn't go smaller than this. And so, yeah. So I get a notebook, I get a pen, right? And before I ever do anything on my 4-step inventory, what I want to do is always start with a prayer. Now, you can use any prayer that you like. You can use the lay aside prayer or the set aside prayer. You can do the 3rd step prayer, any prayer that you like. But I always want to invite God into this process. Because a lot of times, a lot of us have these preconceived notions of the fourth step, and it's big and scary and overwhelming, and we're not having to write alone. And so before I do any writing on my fourth step, I want to start with a prayer. And a prayer that you could use, again, a number of them, but I always like to say things like, God, I ask that you would just be with me as I go through this process of the step 4. I pray that you would guide my heart, guide my mind, and guide my pen. I pray that you would reveal to me that which I need to see. Help me to see the truth about myself. Something like that. Any prayer that you want to say. And then when we're ever done writing on our fourth step, so every time we start writing, every time we're done writing, what we want to do is we want to wrap it up with a prayer. And again, it can be any prayer that you want to use. You could use your own words, anything like that. But I like to use one that's a little like, God, I ask that you'd help me to leave my thoughts, my feelings, and emotions of this fourth step contained within the pages of this book. I ask that you help me go out from here to be of love and service to my fellows and to you. Thank you, God. Something like that, you know? Whatever words you want, however you want. But I always think it's good to bookmark it with prayer. And then the first thing that we're going to do before we do any getting into the nitty gritty is we're going to draw some lines, right? And here's the thing. I work with a lot of people. Sometimes people have some fears about the fourth step, but we're starting with lines. What I want to point out is most of us weren't afraid of lines before, you know? Most of us had no trouble with lines. So it's a nice, easy way for us to get into the fourth step. And yeah, no pressure, no stress. We're just going to draw some lines. And that's what we're going to do. And so my codependent butt is also going to try to describe the lines on the piece of paper for those that are listening. I'll do another set of Al-Anon steps soon. You know, I might be in the middle of an Al-Anon relapse. It's all good. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw one line horizontally across the page. And then we're going to draw 2 lines up, right? So one horizontally across the page and 2 lines from that horizontal line up to the top of the notebook. And what that's going to create is it's going to create 3 columns on the top of the notebook and 1 big column underneath. Does that make sense? Gosh, I hope so. Especially I hope so for those that are able to visualize it and actually see. Because if I'm not describing and showing it very well, goodness, keep coming back, page. And so what I'm going to do is then flip the page. 1 line horizontally across that page and 2 lines coming up from it to the top of the notebook. 3 columns on top, 1 big column that's the whole bottom half of the page. And I'm going to do that again and again. Line, 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 line. Again, we had no problem with that before. And so we're going to just keep doing that. And we're going to do that on, let's say, 50, 100, no problem. You're, again, not going to run out of lines, That's old behaviors. I will say it's not old if we're still doing it. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to draw those columns. And that same format of columns we are going to use for our resentments, our fears, and our sex conduct. So again, don't worry about drawing too many lines. We're going to use these 3 sections and cover, these lines and cover all 3 sections with them. And again, you might have, if you've come here and you've done inventory different ways or used the printed out sheets or had your sponsor draw out the lines a different way, that is okay. I'm showing you this way because what we'll do is we'll have 1 resentment per piece of paper. Similarly, when we get to fears, we're going to have 1 fear per piece of paper, and 1 sex or relationship conduct per piece of paper. So this is not the most environmentally friendly of ways to write inventory, but it gives us a lot of room to work. And it also helps me take it 1 step at a time and 1 column at a time. And that's what we want to do, because so often I can just overwhelm myself and get all messed up trying to do it all at once. It just helps me to keep it simple, one thing at a time. And I will make amends to trees or something. So keep coming back. All right. I want to just another, so yeah, notebook, pen, draw the lines. Another thing that can be helpful is if you do live with other people, it can be good to have a place where you know, where you keep your fourth step, where you know it's going to be. So not necessarily leaving it lying about, because there's some stuff we might not want our spouse to read or our family members to read, or if we're in a sober living environment or with roommates, we might not want them to read that. So just have a place where we can keep that fourth step, where we know where it is when we're not working on it. And that's just kind of good practical advice. And so that's what we're going to do. And one of the things that I do with my sponsees is when we do the third step, I'll be with them and I will sit with them throughout as much of the fourth step process as they're open to or they're willing to. So I will sit with them as they draw lines, and I will sit with them as they get into the resentment sections. And in so doing, honestly, most of the time, we're done the first 3 columns of resentments in like an hour or 2. And so it's one of those ways where it's a lot of times what I've found is the barriers to the fourth step is that overthinking, that sort of analysis paralysis, that like, am I doing it right? That fear of doing it, but I will dive in with you. And we're halfway through resentments before we even know what happened. And we're in the middle of it. And there's no time to be scared. There's no time to pump the brakes. We're in it and we're doing it. And we realize, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, which is every time with any sort of spiritual action, right? I think it's going to be this big deal, and it's actually a quite freeing experience. And so I've been around for a while, and as we see my defects glaring currently, I've needed to continue to take inventory. So I've done a lot, like probably more than I could count, of inventories and of fourth steps. And, you know, I use this process in my evening review. So when I put pen to paper on my evening review, I use these columns as things pop up. And even when I call people for 10th steps, or sometimes it's a voice text thing for 10 steps, but I talk it through these columns that we're going to learn. So what we're learning is some of the fundamental building blocks of how we live this way of life, which is actually really exciting. And so one of the things, like, we ought not scare newcomers about the fourth step. Like, we got to get hyped. Like, this is awesome. We're gonna learn a new way of life. You know, that stuff that was eating us alive, dude, we're gonna get some freedom from it, and in ways we never thought possible. So that's what we're gonna do. So those are the common manifestations of self. So we're gonna get into our first section of resentments. And our first section of step 4, which is resentments. So it says resentment is the #1 offender. So it's the big one, right? It's the big one that's blocking us off from God. So we're going to deal with that first. But for those who have been here before, you know, I'm a bit of an etymology nerd, which is where words come from, which I'm sure is actually a shock to no one who's just joined us today when I'm like, I think this is an A5 paper size, and that might be an A4. You know, we're not surprised you're a nerd. But the word resentment, it comes from French, and then I believe French to Latin, but the word means to refeel. So when we look at resentments, what we're really looking at is a refeeling of a negative emotion. That's what we're looking at. And the biggest thing that I will say, and I'm saying it early, I'm saying it before I ought to, but I'll probably say it again: do not self-edit. If I've started with a prayer, I've asked the God of my understanding to guide my thoughts. Don't self-edit. Because a lot of times the biggest barrier that I've seen in myself, in others, working with sponsees, is when we want to be like, oh, it's not really a resentment. I'm just a little frustrated, to which I turn them to A Vision for You. I believe it's page 151, where it tells us the 4 horsemen: terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. You know, it's one of the horsemen. Let's do some columns, you know, right? Do not self-edit, do not minimize it. Just put it to paper. Worst case scenario, we wasted a piece of paper, you know, Best case scenario, freedom, freedom. So it says from it. So from resentment stem all forms of spiritual disease. So from a single resentment can stem all forms of spiritual disease. We're dealing with something that is serious. Again, so it does not behoove me, why am I using that word, to minimize it. It is not a good idea for me to self-edit. It is not a good idea for me to be like, oh no, I let go of that years ago. It doesn't bother me, just write it down. So it says, for we have been not only mentally and physically ill. So again, for those that are new and like new to the program as well, I want to talk about when we speak of being mentally ill, what we're talking about is our mental obsession. And that is that insane thought that I have when I'm as sober as I am today that tells me this time will be different. Nobody will ever know. I'll go for 3 drinks or 3 days, and I'll get it together after the long weekend, right? That insane thought that takes me back to that first drink. That's what we're talking about. And then when it talks about us being physically ill, what we're talking about is that physical allergy, that thing that happens once I start to drink. And once I start to drink, I need more. And the more that I drink, the more that I need to drink. And I can't control the amount that I take. And it's like I drink and I get thirstier. That's what we're talking about. So we have been not only mentally and physically ill, and that is what we hammered home on step 1. Mental obsession, physical allergy, mental obsession, physical allergy. And I was sharing over the last few weeks where we really see the emergence of the description of the spiritual malady is in the remainder of the steps. We hammer home mental and physical in step 1, and we see the description of the bedevilments, full of fear, couldn't make a living, feeling of uselessness, couldn't be of real help to other people. We see that in step 2, and in step 3, we see the effects of coming from that place of pain, coming from that acute sense of separateness from God, because that's really what the spiritual malady is, an acute sense of separateness from God. And of course, alcoholics, addicts, people with addictions do not have a monopoly on spiritual malady. Human beings can have a spiritual malady. But the problem is, for me, that spiritual malady fuels that insane thought that tells me I can drink again. I know it'll relieve this pain. And that's the first drink. And so we see this awakening to that spiritual malady, which I believe is that sense of separateness from God. And how I get that sense of separateness from God is that stuff inside me, the stuff in the hoarder's house, the garbage, right? That's just blocking me. And the garbage, again, is not me. No problem. So glad you came. Always so lovely to see you. But that garbage is not me. And we know that to be true because it gets removed. So that's what we're clearing away. So when the spiritual malady is overcome, when we treat that, and how we treat that is with the spiritual awakening, we straight out mentally and physically. So it says, in dealing with resentments, we set them on paper. So again, I'm a big believer in pen to paper. I do know that there are people, physical disabilities, limitations that type it out, but I'm a big believer pen to paper. And the reason is because people will be like, well, they didn't have computers back then. But a little bit of a fun fact, they did have typewriters. That's not a fun fact. That's just the fact. I'm going to make it fun in a second. The big book, much of the big book was actually written on a typewriter. It was in New Jersey, across the Hudson from New York City, and it was Bill Wilson dictating it to the Secretary Ruth Hawk. So typewriters existed, and that's just a little fun fact that was preceded by just a fact that wasn't very fun. Typewriters, they were a thing, All right, so we set them on paper. And so it says, we listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry, and we stop there. That is going to be our column 1. And one of the biggest things that I have found to be so important, and of course, people sometimes see it differently or approach it differently, but for me, it's so crucial to do one column at a time. So what we want to do is do all of column 1 before we get into any other column. So I want to get all of column 1 done and then get into column 2. And so how it is going to look. Oh man, this is going to be real tough to explain. But the first column on the right is going to be, for top right is going to be our column 1. And so what we're going to do, what comes to mind, we write it down. So we're going to start, and who is it normally first? It's mom. So mom, flip the page. Dad, flip the page. X number 1, flip the page. And then X number 2, that jerk, flip the page, right? And then it gets more varied. You know, the guy that shares too long at my home group, flip the page. My boss, flip the page, right? So that is what we're going to do to populate our column 1. And one of the things that can be really helpful, I'm just going to screen share, is what we can do is we can look up something. Awesome. Let me know if you guys can see that with the thumbs up. Yeah, okay, good. I did not get any thumbs up. So what we can do is we can look up a step 4 resentment prompt. And we don't have to copy this list. It's just giving us examples of people, of institutions, and of principles that we can resent. So when it talks about people, we have mother, father, mother, sister, brother, and steps. So stepfather, stepmother, stepsisters, stepbrothers, goes into aunts and uncles, and we can resent people like the clergy, the police. Most of us have some resentment with authority, right? Judges, lawyers, doctors, employers, employees, co-workers, in-laws, husbands, wives, ex-husbands, ex-wives, you know what I mean? Partners, and we can go as far back as childhood, right? Lifelong friends, childhood friends, people in AA, people in CA, page that natters on at the big book study, put my name down, right? And one of the things too is often when I'm working with sponsees is I'll go to their social media and I'll have a look at their friends list, and I'm like, what about so-and-so? What about so-and-so? You know, just to populate it. And again, we do not want to self-edit. So when it comes to institutions, some examples of institutions that we can resent could be marriage, Bible, church, religion, races, law, authority, government, political parties, government systems, and systems like education system, correction, mental health, different philosophies, nationalities. Other ones could look like, I resent that meeting. I resent Zoom meetings. I resent in-person meetings. I resent AA. I resent CA. I resent my treatment center. That's always a good one. I resent, we can resent these things that are not people. And so those are some examples of institutions that we can resent. Principles that we can resent. Now, I don't always find this to be the best list, but here's a list that it gives us: God. And that's the thing. If I have God resentments, and goodness in my life I have. If I have God resentments, where I put that is column 1. Column 1, God. Flip the page. Column 2, next resentment. And that's how I work it. But it's got retribution, 10 commandments, just all of these ones. A lot of these are like religious in nature, but some non-religious principles we could resent is things like good girls do this, or married women should do this, or I can resent having to do a 4th step, resentful at having to make amends. I can be resentful that I'm never done this way of life, that I need to continue. I can resent that I have to sponsor. I can resent having to be honest. I can resent having to be open. Any of those sorts of things I can add as well. If it comes to mind, write it down. Do not self-edit. And so that's an example of what we do for column 1. And so once all of column 1 is done, or to the best of our ability, right? To the best of our ability, column 1 is done, we go to column 2. Now, column 2 is going to be the middle of the top row. And it says back on the bottom of page 64, we asked ourselves why we were angry. That's going to be column 2. And the biggest thing for me with column 2 is point 4. Point 4. Because one of the things, sometimes that's where I want to tell the story. You'll notice we only gave that like a little bit of space. This is the column 4. That's where we want to do all the writing. I want to keep this point form. And I want to, point form. I don't want to get into story. I don't want to like overwhelm myself. just stick to the facts, as I will learn that they will change. So point form. And when I'm done all of column 1, I do all of column 2. And then when I am done column 2, we get into the third column. And excuse me. So we asked ourselves why we're angry. That's column 2. Now it says, in most cases, it was found that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our personal relationships, including sex, were hurt or threatened. So we were sore. We were burnt up. I really need to use those words in modern, language, like just, oh, that made me real sore. I'm awful burnt up. But what it's saying is we were resentful. Now, a lot of people take their third column from the very, very bottom of 64. And that's absolutely okay. But for me, at the top of 65, it says on our grudge list, we set opposite each name our injuries. That for me is the instruction, right? So it's saying on our grudge list, now we're going to set opposite. So our grudge list being 1 and 2, we're going to set opposite each name our injuries. And so our third column is going to come from this list right here. So what we're going to do is ask ourselves, did our resentment, or did this resentment affect my self-esteem? And my self-esteem is how I feel about myself. Did it make me feel less about myself, right? Then it says our security. Now, if you're a bottom 64 person and you're like, excuse me, what about pocketbook? Don't you worry. Let us break down security into 3 types of security. So what we can do is we can ask ourselves, did this resentment affect my physical security? Did it affect my physical safety? Welcome, we're on page 65. So what that could look like is if there was physical abuse, if there was a situation where my life was threatened, or I felt like my life would be threatened, that can affect my physical security, and I write it down. Now, financial security, that's the money, right? So if it's work stuff, it affects my money, you stole from me, financial security, write it down. And then emotional security. Did it make me feel emotionally unsafe or emotionally ill at ease, right? If so, write it down. Or our ambitions. So ambition, my ambition is my desire to go out and do things in the world. So let's say I, growing up, had a teacher that was really mean to me. And then I didn't want to try in school. I didn't want to try, and I didn't want to show up, and that would affect my ambition. Let's say I had an ex that was a jerk, which I would, yeah, who has exes that are jerks? I'm sure none of us. I had an ex that was a bit of a jerk, and maybe I'm like, that's it, staying single forever. You know what I mean? We can say that could, affect our ambition. And it's then we look at our personal relations. So did our resentment affect our relationship with others? So let's say it was a work relationship, or a work resentment, and affected my relationship with my colleagues and how I felt about them. Or let's say I got pissed off at somebody at a meeting and I said, that's it, I'm never going to that meeting again. We would never do something so rash. And then I don't get to see my friends. That could affect my personal relations. And then sex relations. And so that affects that intimate, romantic area of our life. But one of the things that I want to point out is that I do not have to have physical, sexual contact with somebody for that resentment to affect my sex relations. So let's say it's a work one. And let's say my boss is just driving me nuts. And I go home and I vent about it to my partner. And my partner's sick of it, and we're fighting, or my partner's like offering solution, and I want validation, things like that, right? Just tell me I'm right and my boss is wrong, So that can affect my sex relations. Oftentimes, even if there's been no abuse in a family, our relationship with our parents affect our sex relations. So again, write it down. And one of the biggest things that I find is that if it's true for you, in column 3, if it's true for you, it's true, right? If you can see the connection, write it down. Because what we're trying to do here is really see the depth of the resentment. So what you'll find, and actually what I will do is I will share, I have this little example. Again, I'll need thumbs up that y'all can see it because I have trust issues. Thank you. So this is an example of what a resentment looks like. So person or institution or principle in column 1. And then again, when I'm all done column 1, I will go to column 2 and do my column 2s. Now, again, it's going to be 1 per page. So this would be 1 resentment per page. My column 2 is going to be point form. He's a jerk. They're a jerk. I hate them. And then I'm taking it from this list. Self-esteem, ambition, physical security, emotional security, financial security, personal relations, or sex relations. And what we find is that the deeper the resentment, the more areas of my life are affected by that. Another way to say that is the more areas of my life that this resentment affects, the deeper the resentment is. And I do know people who do expanded third columns, where they go in a little bit deeper, and you can do some work where you really see where we're putting our reliance upon others instead of God in the third column. But what we're just trying to do at this point, especially if it's our first one, goodness, let's just see the depth of the resentment so that we know the prayers that we need to say to begin to get freedom from it. And so knowing that resentment is the #1 offender, and that from resentment stem all forms of spiritual disease, resentment is going to cut me off from God like nothing else. That third column tells me how much I need to be free of that resentment. That's what it's really informing. So I'm just going to stop the share and we'll get into the example. And what I always love doing is when we get to the 4th column, which I actually we're not going to get to the 4th column today. We'll probably just, wrap up with the example, which I never go early, So, I mean, I shouldn't give myself praise. There's still time for me to go overtime. Still time, you guys. Oh, all right. So we were usually as definite as this example. So we're resentful at Mr. Brown. Now, how we would write it is we would go, Mr. Brown, flip the page. Miss Jones, flip the page. My employer, flip the page. My wife, flip the page. And we would write the cause, flip the page, the cause, flip the page, the cause, flip the page. 1 resentment per page. But that, again, does not work for like putting an example in a book. And so I'm resentful at Mr. Brown. So I'm going to read it, not how we would write it. So I'm resentful at Mr. Brown. The cause, his attention to my wife. And that affects his sex relation and his self-esteem. And in brackets, it says fear. Told my wife of my mistress, sex relations, self-esteem, in brackets, fear. Brown may get my job at the office. Security, self-esteem, fear. Now, you might be like, hey, Paige, how come that third column that they use in the example is different than the example that you gave on page 65? And it's also different than the example that some people use at the bottom of 64. Or you're like, I didn't notice. Why would you point that out? Now that's going to really bother me. And I think it's just an example that there absolutely are precise, clear-cut directions and a little bit of wiggle room. I think truly both things are true. I know people that use the printout sheets and they're able to stay sober, and people that do it this way and they're able to stay sober, right? I really believe that God does not make too hard terms of those who honestly and earnestly seek. And so third column's a little different, and maybe that's just God's way of saying, Paige, don't take yourself so seriously. Like, loosen up, you pedantic, codependent, defect-riddled alcoholic, lighten up. That's just me, though. All right. Then we have the example of Miss Jones. Well, She's a nut. She snubbed me. She committed her husband for drinking. He's my friend. She's a gossip. And that affects the personal relationships. It affects self-esteem and in brackets, fear. And then it says, my employer, unreasonable, unjust, overbearing, threatens to fire me for padding my expense account. Ugh. Self-esteem, in brackets, fear, security. My wife misunderstands and nags. Likes brown, wants house put in her name. And that's going to affect pride, personal relations, sex relations, security, and fear. And so when we go to the fourth column, which we'll do next week, what I love doing is figuring out what would our fourth column be if this was our inventory. And I love doing that with sponsees as well, because sponsees, we read this, we actually don't have any ill will towards Mr. Brown. He didn't actually do anything to me. Although I do know people that have like a shirt that says Mr. Brown needs to get his ass kicked. But he didn't do anything to me. So I'm able to see it as a real neutral example of where I can find my wrongs. And it's wonderful to do. And as I work with sponsees, and then we get into their fourth column. And again, one of the things that I really do is I'll sit with my sponsees as they write, if that's something they're open to and they want to do. And I'll do that with people that aren't my sponsees. You know, I'll sit with them for inventory. It's one of my favorite things to do. And it might seem like, isn't that a little weird, a little awkward? They're just writing and you're just sitting there. It's fine. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. And it's incredible how, see, that's the thing. Most people's experience with our 4 steps, it's like, oh, it takes months. No, it takes months of procrastinating and sitting on it, not doing it. But only a couple hours of writing at most. And again, in an hour or 2 with people, I'm usually in the 4th column with them already. So again, it does not take long. And so I want to help them. I want to help them launch. And so I'll offer if anyone needs help with inventory and we're able to make our schedules work, you let me know. I'll hang out and write inventory. And a hopeful note to end on. We'll leave it there and we'll pick up next week as we get into sorry, my brain stopped working. There was a question and I tried to read and speak at the same time. I'm also good at multitasking and I'm very focused. So we'll pick up next week and yeah, we'll pick up and dive right into the 4th step and right into those prayers, and it'll be exciting. That's where the solution is. That's where the light comes. So I will close and